Now, you say, gee, Chuck, are there such things in the New Testament? There is one possibility. You may recall in John chapter 19, Jesus is hung on the cross, the crucifixion has taken place. Pilate himself, personally, wrote the titlon. The titlon was the accusation that was posted on the crucified person. In other words, what the Romans did is they crucified a criminal, and they would put the crime, or whatever it was, they would label it for all to see. They always did this by a roadway or a junction where there's lots of traffic, because they wanted to get across the penalty for infringing on the Roman law, whatever. So the titlon was part of the procedure. In this case, Pilate himself writes this. Here is the personal representative of the ruler of the world who is labeling Jesus Christ on his death here. He wrote a titlon and he put it on the cross. The writing was, quote, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title was then read by many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh unto the city. And it was written in Hebrew and also in Greek and in Latin. It was written in Hebrew first because it was a Hebrew culture that was being manifested. And it's interesting that Pilate could write Hebrew. I think that's interesting. It was written in Greek because that was the common international language of the empire. And it was written in Latin because that was the official language of the empire. But many trafficking in that world may not speak Latin. That was the big thing, of course, at Rome, but not necessarily throughout the rest of the world. Greek was, because of the previous efforts 3 centuries earlier of Alexander the Great, who enforced Greek as an international standard. So even if you were Jewish, you probably spoke Greek. You may or may not speak Hebrew. But it was Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Well, it's interesting. Anytime you and I run the risk of missing something, the chief priests and the Pharisees come to our rescue. See, every time something happens that we might not understand, you'll discover the Holy Spirit calls our attention to the fact that there's a group that are really upset about it. See, it says then, the next paragraph says, then said the chief priests of the Jews to Pilate, write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Why are they so upset? They don't like what he said. And there's several possibilities here, but I want you to notice what Pilate's response is. What I have written, I have written. Pilate, for whatever reason, sticks to his guns. Go away, don't bother me. Now, it's interesting. You could argue that what he said was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Here's the personal representative of the ruler of the world declaring that Jesus was the King. 4 days ago, he entered Jerusalem riding a donkey. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. Presenting himself exactly the way the Old Testament specified the Messiah would. And here the ruler of the world, in effect, acknowledges that reality. That could be very reasonably the thing that bothered these guys, but there may be something else hidden behind the scenes. Here is what that actually said. What he wrote was, in Hebrew, this is what he wrote, apparently, or something approximating it, which says, Yeshua HaNazarai V'Melech HaYehudim. Jesus, the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. What's interesting about this is the acrostic. The first letter of each word spells Yahweh, the unpronounceable name of God. And it's my suspicion that Pilate did this on purpose, because he knew how these guys think. And he put the needle in because he not only expressed it in translation, but he expressed it structurally in the way they're used to seeing these acrostics. How fascinating. It's interesting that the next morning, these same guys come to him, all upset. It's funny to me how the disciples couldn't watch with him 1 hour in Gethsemane, but his enemies worked through the night. It's interesting, too, that the disciples didn't, even though he told them several times that he was going to be killed and raised on the third day, the disciples didn't understand. But it's interesting how his enemies did. They come to Pilate that following morning and said, let's not make the next mistake worse than the first. Interesting remark, because they're acknowledging it was a mistake. Gee, they had earthquake and darkness, and I mean, wow. But let's put a guard on the tomb so they don't steal the body. It's interesting to notice what Pilate says to them. He says, you have a guard, make it as sure as you can. In his very accommodation, you can detect a note of futility in his heart. He says, make it as sure as you can. You get the impression that he knew that whatever they did wouldn't be sufficient. I suspect that when Pilate found out that the tomb was empty, I don't think he was surprised. And I don't think, clearly he didn't hold the guards accountable. He didn't them all executed. He knew somehow that he had a tiger by the tail through his wife and other circumstances. I don't know, but when I get to heaven, I will not be surprised if Pilate's there. He may have become a believer through all this harrowing experience.